They were children, not teenagers, not adults pretending to be young. Actual children. Some of them were barely tall enough to see over a courtroom desk. Some still carried toys in their pockets. And yet, their names would become etched into British legal history forever. When people think about crime, they imagine intent, planning, fully formed understanding. But the history of crime in the United Kingdom forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes, the people who commit the most shocking acts are the least equipped to understand what they've done. The idea of a young criminal feels like a contradiction. Childhood is supposed to be a time of learning, of protection, of mistakes without permanent consequences. But for centuries, British law did not see childhood that way. For much of its history, the legal system treated children not as developing minds, but as small adults. In early Britain, there was no clear line separating childhood from criminal responsibility. A child who could speak, work, or follow instructions could also be punished. In the 18th and 19th centuries, children as young as 7 were regularly arrested, charged, and imprisoned. Their crimes were often small: stealing bread, picking pockets, begging. But the punishment was real. Prison cells were shared with adults. Discipline was harsh. Rehabilitation barely existed as a concept. This was not because society was cruel by nature. It was because poverty was everywhere. Industrial Britain was crowded, desperate, and unforgiving. Children worked in factories, mines, and on the streets. Crime was survival. And survival was criminalized. As Britain modernized, the idea of childhood slowly began to change. Laws were introduced. Schools expanded. Child labor was restricted. But one thing remained stubbornly low: the age of criminal responsibility. In England and Wales, that age is 10. That means that from the age of 10, a child can be arrested, questioned, charged, tried in court, and punished under criminal law. It is one of the lowest ages of criminal responsibility in Europe, and it has shaped some of the most controversial cases in British history. In 1993, the country was confronted with a case that would redefine how Britain viewed child crime forever. The murder of 2-year-old James Bulger shocked the nation, not only because of its brutality, but because of who was responsible. 2 boys, both 10 years old. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Newspapers used words like evil and monsters. Headlines demanded maximum punishment. The idea that children could commit such an act felt unbearable, and the country searched for something to blame. The trial itself became a symbol. 2 children sitting in an adult courtroom surrounded by legal language they barely understood. Psychologists testified that their emotional development was limited, that their understanding of consequences was incomplete. But the court decided that they knew enough. They were convicted and sentenced to detention without a fixed end date. They became the youngest convicted murderers in modern UK history. That case did not answer the question of how young is too young. It only made the question impossible to ignore. Decades earlier, Britain had already faced a similar shock. In 1968, a 10-year-old girl named Mary Bell was convicted of killing 2 young boys. Her case revealed something deeply unsettling. Her childhood had been filled with neglect, abuse, and instability. Psychiatrists described her not as evil, but as damaged. She was convicted of manslaughter, detained, and eventually released with lifelong anonymity. Her case marked a turning point. For the first time, the public began to seriously consider whether punishment alone could ever make sense when the offender was still a child. These cases exposed a pattern that appears again and again in British crime history. When very young children commit serious crimes, their lives are almost always defined by chaos long before the crime occurs. Neglect, violence, poverty, psychological trauma. These factors do not excuse crimes, but they explain how childhood can fail so completely that a child becomes dangerous. The legal system has struggled to keep pace with this reality. Youth courts were created to separate children from adult offenders. Secure training centers were designed to focus on education and rehabilitation. But critics argue that the system still leans too heavily toward punishment, especially under public pressure. Public anger plays a powerful role. When crimes involve children, emotions run high. There is fear, outrage, and a demand for certainty. People want to believe that there is a clear line between good and evil, even when the offender is young. The idea that a child could be both dangerous and vulnerable at the same time is deeply uncomfortable. Science complicates the picture even further. Modern neuroscience shows that children's brains are still developing well into their 20s. Impulse control, empathy, and long-term reasoning are not fully formed at 10 or even 15. This raises a painful question. If a child's brain is not fully developed, how much responsibility can they truly bear? The UK has never fully resolved this contradiction. On one hand, it recognizes that children are different. On the other, it allows them to be punished almost as harshly as adults. The result is a system that often reacts rather than reflects. Over the years, there have been other cases. Children involved in serious assaults, children convicted of arson, children who killed other children during arguments that spiraled out of control. Many of these cases never become household names, but they leave lasting scars on families and communities. What connects them is not just age, it is failure. Failure of supervision, failure of social support, failure to intervene early. When a child commits a serious crime, it is rarely the first sign that something has gone wrong. It is usually the final one. This is what makes the history of young criminals in the UK so difficult to confront. These stories do not offer easy villains. They force society to look inward. They demand answers to questions that have no simple solutions. Should a child who commits a serious crime be punished to protect society or rehabilitated to prevent future harm? Can both be done at the same time? And how much responsibility belongs not to the child, but to the system that raised them? Every generation faces these questions again. And every time, the answers remain divided. The youngest criminals in UK history are not just cases in law books. They are reminders that justice, when applied to children, becomes something fragile and complicated. They reveal how thin the line can be between protection and punishment, between childhood and criminality. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this. By the time a child commits a serious crime, the real tragedy has often already happened. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison, but years earlier, quietly, when no one was watching.